Hi everyone, and welcome to this webinar from the Football Science Institute. Today we're going to be discussing some nutritional strategies around half-time in matches for players. And just to discuss this, I'm really pleased to be joined by Professor Mark Russell from Leeds Trinity University and Hannah Sheridan from Tottenham Hotspur Football Club. So big thanks to them for joining us and for sharing some of their insights. And it's good to see you guys. I think we're just going to jump in. Maybe Mark, we'll start with you. What are some of the nutritional requirements for players at the end of the first half of a football match?
Yeah, well, first of all, thanks very much for the invite to come along, and I hope everyone's keeping safe and well. Yeah, I think it's a really interesting question, and I think the way we answer it depends upon how we interpret what actually the function or the purpose of halftime is. We can look at halftime from a number of different perspectives. So potentially looking at it as being a period of recovery following the first half, whereby players have started or played some part in it. It can be a period of preparation prior to the second half, and that could be true for players who are potentially going to come on as partial match players or substitutes, finishers, whatever you want to refer to them as later on in the game, or for those individuals that were expecting to play at least some part of the subsequent match, and possibly also with the consideration of if a game may be going to extra time as well. So there's some element of possibly trying to prepare for that. The two main things are probably going to, from a nutritional perspective, going to be focused around hydration and going to be focusing on kind of energy provision or carbohydrate intake. So from a hydration perspective, we're trying to ensure that players don't really hit this 2% body weight loss over the course of the exercise that has been performed. So there's really going to be a focus on hydration, electrolyte consumption, etc. But then also from an energy intake perspective, we're trying to ensure that the fuel that is going to be used within the game, primarily carbohydrate because of the nature of the activity, is going to be replenished to some extent. We know the greatest rates of glycogen depletion occur within the first half, but also then towards the end of the game, we know that the muscle glycogen concentrations really start to diminish, and that potentially becomes a contributor to fatigue in individuals that play for prolonged durations. So if I was going to kind of hang my hat on anything, it was going to be around carbohydrate intake and primarily from a hydration perspective during halftime.
Okay, great. And do you think, just to follow up on that, what do you feel are the best ways to kind of make a judgment on where the players are at? Halftime is going to be busy. Are you taking into account kind of the environment or anything like that when you're thinking about hydration? Is there anything you're doing are you weighing them or anything like that? Or what do you think are the best ways to kind of analyze how they're doing?
Yeah, it's a really interesting follow-up question. I think for me, one of the key things, and it really sounds quite obvious when you say it, is that halftime is another part of the game which I think should be practiced, and potentially practicing hydration strategies, carbohydrate intake strategies that are complementary to what the coaching staff need to achieve and what the regulations allow within that 15-minute window. So don't assume that players and staff will know what to do without having had that opportunity to practice it potentially within pre-season. But then also looking at some of those contextual factors that you alluded to there. So if we know that a game is particularly intense or being played in a hot or humid environment, there may be slight tailoring of strategies that are required based upon some of those factors. But then also, even though we are working within a team sport, really grabbing hold of this concept of individualization, because we know that there are very varied responses in things such as sweat rates, in things such as the response to carbohydrate provision over the course of the game. And similarly, down to some of those factors that we alluded to earlier, whether or not somebody has played any part in the first half versus somebody who started and is likely to play the full 90 minutes. So definitely having that opportunity to kind of have a an appreciation of some of those contextual factors would definitely be worthwhile, and that's where we'd really encourage the benefits of being able to practice within the realms of what's possible, obviously, different scenarios from a halftime perspective.
Interesting. So Hannah, then, given some of those requirements and contextual factors, when you're at the club, what sort of processes are you going through once that kind of whistle ends the first half?
Yeah, I think Mark picked up on a few really good points there, and one of the things that kind of dictates what we do at halftime is sometimes dependent on the coaching staff that we have and their philosophy. But again, individualisation was something else that Mark mentioned, and 100% that's something we really try and focus on, but also practice in pre-season. So the key things for us would be refueling, rehydrating, and then because it fits in nicely with the R's, we call it refocus, but it's mainly around those players that decide to add in caffeine into their routine at half time. To be honest, quite a lot of them would do the caffeine, would take the caffeine on board in the warm-up, so prior to the first half, so that it's peaking as they're starting that first half. But there is quite a few now that will take on more on board as well at half time. Something that works really well is trying to combine those 2 or 3, refueling and rehydrating within one kind of drink or one option, so they don't have to take multiple things on board. So we have quite a lot of players that will have a high carbohydrate electrolyte drink, some that will have like an iced slushy, again made with a cordial that contains sugar in, and we add electrolytes into that. Some will have part solid food, so maybe like banana or mango, and again these are like really dependent on culture as well, along with some sort of fluid. So yeah, I would say our main focuses are refueling with at least 30 grams of carbohydrate, rehydrating with some sort of fluid that contains electrolytes, and we try and based on sweat composition testing that we do within the season, usually in pre-season, we try and individualize those drinks, and then anyone that has caffeine, that would be the time that they may take on extra caffeine on board.
Great. So you've spoken quite a bit about the kind of individualization that you guys will go through. How much of that personalization is down to, like you said, the sweat testing and the different tests you subject the players to, and your understanding of them as individuals, and how much of it is cultural and personal preference and trying to cater for them?
Yeah, I would say it's probably, but a bigger percentage of it is to do with personal preferences, because as well that affects them so much mentally and psychologically as well. So they might not choose the best carbohydrate option, for example, but if they feel that works and they enjoy having that at halftime, then that is more important than really pushing them towards something that they don't like. So yeah, in terms of like personal preference, we trial this out in the preseason, and obviously we try and we give them options that are useful and beneficial. Some options are just easier than others to gain that kind of like 30 grams of carbohydrate in. And then yeah, especially the hydration side of things is very much individualized based on testing. So yeah, I would say it's a mix of both, but probably personal preference comes into it a lot. The other thing I'd say it's what players can tolerate. So some players can eat bananas and mango, whereas other players, there's no way they could stomach that from a GI perspective. So they may be players that go for like more of a gel or a carb electrolyte drink.
Great. So yeah, I guess one of the things that's good to kind of appreciate is that if the player doesn't like what they're being given, they're definitely not going to take it. So you need to try and cater for them.
Yeah, exactly.
You also mentioned a couple of times caffeine there, just for any listeners or viewers who maybe don't understand the role of caffeine. Maybe you just give us a quick kind of overview on why players would be taking caffeine before or even halftime during the game.
Yeah, so caffeine is known to help with like alertness and kind of suppress feelings of fatigue. So a lot of players feel like you know, if they're hyped up, ready for the start of the game through having some form of caffeine, then mentally they're in a better state of mind to start the game. It can also help with skill acquisition, but again, it's very individual. So we've got players that could have, you know, a very small amount of caffeine, the equivalent of say 75 milligrams, and then you've got players that can tolerate a lot more than that, and that works for them. Whereas, you know, a player that's quite sensitive to caffeine, if they took a large amount, actually would have a detrimental effect on performance. So again, that's something that we really practice as well, and get them to trial out in training, especially in pre-season and pre-season matches where a lot lower key matches, before putting that into practice in the season.
Great, thanks. So we've heard a kind of a few different strategies there, from drinks to gels and things like that. Mark, from your point of view, from a research point of view, is there anything in particular that has got a lot of efficacy behind it, that's been shown to be really effective as a kind of ideal strategy that you'd recommend?
In terms of an optimal strategy, then it's very difficult to give a kind of a one-size-fits-all approach. I think there's definitely a few key considerations which may be useful to bear in mind, given that, as Hannah's alluded to, there's different practices that different managers or coaching staff will want to engage with, possibly consistently throughout the season or at different points. So it's worth bearing that in mind. I think any interventions that are put in place, time is not your friend during halftime. So maybe trying to look at doing things as soon as possible. So it may seem quite kind of basic, but do you have to wait until players get into the changing rooms in order to start some of the interventions? Could they be given something possibly down the tunnel, or even as they're coming off the pitch? If you bear in mind, it might take a couple of minutes either side of the halftime window to physically get back into the changing rooms and then reappear onto the pitch. Have you lost 4 to 5 minutes of your total window there as a potential opportunity? There's also considerations around whether or not you want to combine factors. So as Hannah's also alluded to, maybe combining multiple factors in a single drink. But then also, do we want to combine the nutritional strategies potentially with more physical strategies? So some clubs will encourage and engage with possibly a halftime re-warm up. So if there's then 3 or 4 minutes towards the end of the halftime break, whereby a period of exercise, possibly including high intensity components, can we then combine some degree of maybe carbohydrate consumption there? Because we know that if it's primarily a passive halftime period, whereby there's not much activity undertaken and high amounts of carbohydrate are consumed, then there is possibly detrimental effects earlier on in the second half from a physiological kind of readiness perspective, from a blood glucose side of things, where there's actually a transient drop between maybe 45 and 60 minutes. Whether or not that has any performance effect remains to be kind of concretely determined. But then can we look at things in terms of, okay, well, do we change when carbohydrate is consumed? So do we really focus on carbohydrate at the start of the halftime period, or do we look at it towards the end, possibly because it can be combined with high intensity exercise and maybe having a dampening effect on that reduction that can occur? And there's factors there to consider around what actually players are going to engage with, and again, what really complements what is currently happening. We could come up with a perfect theoretical halftime protocol, but if it has no application to what a player is going to do or what a manager wants to achieve, then it stays just that, purely theoretical. So it's getting that balance between, okay, well, this is current practice. Can we then add in certain tweaks or certain things that we play with to see whether or not this is tolerated? And again, that concept of individualization comes in. It may work for some, it may not work for others. And if it kind of challenges some of that superstition, which match day is very often focused around. Whether or not it's founded in science, again, can be half the battle. So that's another consideration there, is getting some of the benefits into practices that complement what is already going on.
That's a good point. And I think one of those areas at half time that can often be a bit fraught, or a little bit where you're a little bit rushed, is if the sub's made at half time, or players getting ready because they've been told they're coming on quite short after the half time. Hannah, is there anything around substitutes you particularly think about at half time in terms of preparing them?
Yeah, so most of the time substitutes will be out on the pitch, continuing to stay warm with one of the sports scientists. So we actually have like a nutrition bench bag that stays outside, and within that there's various gels, caffeine options, bars, so some like small flapjack bars, things like that, and also drinks as well. So they're encouraged to stay hydrated whilst they're doing that bit of warm up, and also anyone that kind of feels like they need a bit of a top up of energy or wants to take the caffeine on board, they may do then. The other thing with having it on the bench is actually that, you know, if players are going to come on at 60 minutes into the game, it's probably better that they take their caffeine on board in the first half, during the first half, but with the bag there, it allows that opportunity. So yeah, I'm not usually outside on the pitch with the subs. I'd be inside with the rest of the squad, but yeah, that the sports scientists are aware of that whilst they're warming up, that obviously their individualized drinks are available outside, and carbohydrate options as well.
Great. So we've heard quite a lot there about some of the many ways in which halftime is affected by the context of the game at a professional level, and some of the kind of extent to which you're going to provide for the players and try and get things as good as you can for them. I was just wondering if there were any solutions you'd recommend for players below that level, or perhaps youth players, to their parents or coaches or whatever, who don't have access to sweat testing and that kind of thing, and maybe slushy machines in the dressing room. But you know, what are some good real world solutions?
Yeah, well, back in the day, I was doing work experience with clubs at a lower level who wouldn't have had the budget that we do in the Premier League. And one of the real easy things is you kind of still focusing on that refueling and replenishing carbohydrate and energy stores, and also rehydrating is your two main focuses. So you can make homemade sports drinks. So having like a high juice, which is over here, is like a cordial or a squash that contains sugar. And adding a pinch of salt to it, for example, with water, then kind of make your own sports drinks. Having really cheap but really good effective options for carbohydrate snacks, so things like jelly babies or bananas are a really easy one and pretty cost effective as well. And then another tool that might be useful, and again is very cheap, is doing the weigh in weigh out method, which is even used, across the board, up to your top level clubs, but just so players can get to have a rough idea of their sweat losses throughout a game if you're monitoring fluid intake as well. It's just a simple way for players and coaches and staff to understand individual sweat rates and maybe individualize the volume that players need to consume after to rehydrate. So aiming for that like 150% of fluid losses after a game, especially in summer when there's warmer temperatures.
Fantastic. And Mark, last one really, I think for you was, is there anything suggesting or around different populations? Obviously we've talked a lot about the professional men's game. We talk about youth players or the female game, which is obviously growing massively, which is great. Are there any other considerations, or is it all fairly similar kind of recommendations across the board?
I think a lot of the recommendations are fairly consistent across the board, and I think that type of question lends itself to a counter argument of, well, actually, are players in the state that we think they are at the start of the game or at certain points? So, for instance, although we talk about players hopefully starting a game hydrated, from an empirical evidence observation perspective, then sometimes that may not always be the case, and trying to ensure that those fluid losses are controlled for in terms of ensuring that players are in the best state starting from a hydration perspective, being as hydrated as possible, being carbohydrate fed within that 24 to 48 hours that is preceding the match, and consequently then looking at possibly having strategies that change, not necessarily based on population, but maybe some of the contextual factors that we talked about in terms of the environment, because we know that that's a quite key contributor to the way that the body responds physiologically in terms of glycogen utilization, etc. So from a half-time perspective, I wouldn't necessarily say that there are too many differences between certain populations. If we can get the basics done right across the board, whether that's the youth recreational level, the kind of the youth populations that are working within academies and are in like the feeder systems for the professional clubs, if we can get those basics done well, then I think that's going to be a step in the right direction. That's not to say that they're currently not done well, but it's just it needs to be based on that foundation principle of they are fed, not fasted, as we would never expect them to be fasted going into a game, but they're as optimally fed as possible, carbohydrate pre-exercise. We're then topping things up and ensuring hydration in those kind of 4 to 6 hours prior to the game, especially more so important the earlier the kickoff, because that probably puts an increased importance on the meal the night before if there's not that opportunity to get quite a large volume of food and fluid in the morning. And then if we can ensure those basics are in place, then we're building from strong foundations.
Fantastic. Well, I think that kind of just about brings me to the end of the questions I had. And I think there's just a bit of a wrap up. I think key points for me were refuel and rehydrate, try and make it specific to the individual, and that will probably come around through some trial and practice and taking into account all the different contextual factors that can occur around the match, temperature, humidity, that kind of thing, and as well as the individual differences. So some really great takeaways there, and yeah, it just remains for me to say thanks for joining us, and especially to Hannah and Mark for giving up their time for us as well. It's been really interesting and I really appreciate it. So thanks very much.
Thank you.